The name Morgan is on not one but three of the largest and most influential banks around the world. So the two obvious ones are Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan. What people don't know is that Deutsche Bank's investment banking arm was actually just Morgan
Are you
Grenfell.
serious?
Yeah.
Well, I had no
Which was
idea.
actually, yeah, because they bought it out, I think, in the 90s, and then at some point they scrubbed the name. And so their roots within the financial system run deep. And so today what we want to talk about is the history of the Morgan family and the Morgan Bank, and particularly its intertwinement with the United States financial system, which today pretty much defines the world. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about the waning of American global hegemony, but the one thing underpinning it really is the strength of the US dollar as a global reserve currency. And there's no evidence that this is going to change anytime soon. I mean, if you just look through, all of the different equivalents or replacements,
Alternatives,
all the
yeah.
alternatives, there's just not many good options. And I mean, there's some talk about Bitcoin, but even that itself is incredibly experimental.
Volatile.
Yeah, and this system was very much built on the power of the Morgan Bank, who was kind of the
Wow.
first great American financial institution.
So they literally defined America and built it into what it is today in many ways, is what you're kind of saying.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and not only the U.S. but in a sense like what you would call the global world order, which there's big debates on like when exactly that started. I would, borrowing from my old advisor Adam Tooze, I would argue that it goes back to 1916, because that was a year that
Great Divergence, or is that?
no. This is the Great Divergence is something else. This is kind of like arguably the year that the U.S. became the main organizing force of the world financial system. And the reason for 1916 is because this was midway through World War One. The economies of all the Allied powers were all already depleted.
Right.
And so that was a year that America began lending huge amounts of arms and money to the Allied powers to continue financing the war. And in fact, they were also lending Germany too. So they were eventually funding both sides of the war. But the thing is, this was during a time when America was like what you would call isolationist.
Right. They
And
didn't
so
pick a side. They didn't-
no, and so actually, all the lending was not going through the government. It's not like today where you see the government lending huge amounts of money to Ukraine. It was going from Wall Street. It was JP Morgan. Yeah. So the JP Morgan Bank was the official and exclusive lender to both Germany, France, and Britain during World War II. And then what happened was that it was the Jewish banks like Kuhn and Loeb and Goldman Sachs. These were the kind of like two big Jewish banks in the American financial system who were lending to Germany.
That's really ironic if you think about it.
Exactly. It is ironic. Yeah, it is ironic because like one of the foundations of anti-Semitism in Germany, particularly in the war period, was just the idea that they, I mean, this is like the so-called like backstabbing myth. It was just the idea that Germany had been backstabbed by like greedy Jews, whereas in reality, actually, the Jewish banks and the Jewish banks were being widely prosecuted in the U.S. for lending money
To Germany.
and so the irony is that actually the Jewish banks were keeping the German economy afloat during the war,
In World War One, though. Right?
and during World War One, during World War One. And so anyways, to go back to my original point, that was when basically the world got intertwined through sovereign debt. But all of it
1916.
in 1916, but all of it going back to the U.S. Because I mean, prior to that, the U.S. had already become the largest economy in the world. I mean, this is like what economic historians call like the second Great Divergence. So the first Great Divergence was Europe, Western Europe particularly, eclipsing the rest of the world
Right.
around
Particularly Asian empires.
around-
Asian civilization.
around the 19th, exactly, particularly China and India, around the 19th century. Though of course part of the debate is exactly when that took place. So some people will trace it as far back as like the Protestant Revolution, the invention of the printing press, the invention of science in the 17th
invention of
century,
joint stock companies, right?
the invention of joint stock companies, exactly. But anyways, the second Great Divergence is the U.S. jumping incredibly far ahead of the rest of the world, and this arguably happens between about 1870 and 1910, depending on who you ask. So going into World War One, the U.S. think about this for a sec. The combined domestic GDP of the U.S. was already larger than the combined GDP of the entire British Empire,
See,
which
no
at
one-
the time was was
the largest
yeah,
empire.
which literally ruled
in
half the world. Exactly, which was at its peak. So just think about that for a sec. That's
We should definitely pause on that thought because I feel like, when you kind of talk about American hegemony and exceptionalism, that usually almost stems in the post-World War II period, right? Like following World War II, this is seen as the era of American dominance, right? But I think putting that date even back a couple decades earlier to 1916 is so not obvious.
yeah, it isn't.
Right?
It isn't. Yeah, so most people go to World War II
World War
because
II.
that was when it became emphatic. But the thing is that finance predated, I think, like American military and cultural hegemony.
So
And-
what was
and
that
I think
back
that's
to the
yeah, in some way. I mean I think that's a really important point. And so what we want to do today is kind of trace this back to the early history of the J.P. Morgan Bank, because what's interesting is that if you take classes like AP US History, like APUSH, and the American education system, they almost never talk about banking or the Morgan family.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up. I think
Yeah.
so much of the study of history or just anyone's sort of political discussions, right? When you're talking about wars, when you're talking about different empires, I feel like the economy or the banking system that actually literally funds these empires is so often neglected, right? And not spoken
Yeah.
about at all.
And the irony, I think, going back to our earlier point, is you can argue that this is probably the most important facet of American hegemony in the modern day. Because if you think about it,
Even to today.
yeah, exactly. I mean, today American cultural hegemony is waning,
Certainly waning.
and military hegemony is being challenged everywhere. And so really I think what's keeping the U.S. afloat right now is financial hegemony.
And
so
technological
in a way, technological, but I think that's also intertwined. And we could
With
do
the financial system that
and we could
funds that,
do a very interesting episode on just how like the development of Silicon Valley, even though it's often seen as bootstrapping technologists, is very much a story about the financial system.
Of Wall
Because
Street.
it was the financial system, who was pumping cash. But anyways, that's an aside. So what we want to talk about now is kind of when did the J.P. Morgan Bank start and how did they rise to dominance? And I think the first interesting point I want to make is that actually the J.P. Morgan Bank was not started by a Morgan. It was started in the mid to early 19th century by a guy named George Peabody, and neither was it an American bank. It was actually it was a London-based merchant bank,
Okay.
and merchant bank is just an early word for investment banking.
Okay.
And because remember, this is a time when America was still getting up and running, and so the World Financial Center was London.
So this was the mid to early 19th century.
Yeah, mid to early 19th century.
So this is around the Gilded. Oh, yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Not even.
No,
Yeah,
this
pre-Gilded
is
Age.
pre-Gilded Age, and so
Got it.
and so
yeah,
George
America was
Peabody.
literally just getting started.
Yeah, exactly, and they predominantly sold railway bonds to London investors.
Okay.
So they were transatlantic Atlantic Bank, and this was a time too when Americans in general were not respected in London. They were kind of seen as these second class and
Country
and,
bumpkins.
And, yeah,
if you may.
country. I've never heard that one, but we could use that. But yeah, they were seen as kind of like low lives and second class citizens. And so George Peabody's great achievement was that he was the first person and the first bank that was widely recognized in London and that was well respected.
Wow.
And so what happened is that right before George Peabody was about to die, his entire life he was known as this incredibly frugal individual. Like when he would send his servants out on like grocery runs, he would ask for like every penny back. He was like that level of cheap. And so right before he died, he kind of had this religious awakening, and he realized that he wanted to leave a legacy where he was remembered more for philanthropy than for money. And so
they started to fund wars instead.
No. This is later. This is later on. No, and George Peabody himself too. He was like a very troubled individual. He had lots of mistresses but no heirs. So he had no official heirs. I think he definitely had some unofficial heirs, like some bastards, but he had no official heirs. And so what happened is he went out and he started sourcing for basically someone to take over the Peabody Bank. And so and at the time, Junius Morgan was an associate at the Boston office of the Peabody Bank, and Junius Morgan was John Pierpont Morgan's father. So
Philip of Macedon almost.
yeah, kind of. Yeah, so you can think of it like Yeah, like JP stands for John Pierpont. So he was the one who built the bank.
So this is the son of Junius Morgan.
No, this is the father. Yeah, sorry. John Pierpont is the son of Junius.
Right.
Yeah,
the
the analogy I like to draw is like Junius Morgan as like this third patriarch. He laid the foundation, like, you know, in the same way that Philip of Macedon, he built the army, but it was John Pierpont who took it to greatness.
Right.
But all of the foundations were laid by Junius. And so Junius was a young associate, and he was recommended to Peabody. So they basically, you know, sat down for a coffee. I mean, I'm speaking in modern terms, obviously. They had they had a little LinkedIn coffee chat. Yeah. And basically he decided I'm gonna hand you the empire when I die. And so they basically wrote up a contract saying 10 years from now when I die, I'm gonna pass on the Peabody Bank to Junius Morgan and he's gonna run it. And then what happens is that because of his religious awakening, he ended up striking his name from the bank last minute. So he got really into philanthropy. So almost every Ivy League school now has like a Peabody Hall. So like Harvard has like a Peabody Hall.
That comes from this guy.
Yeah, and it's all George Peabody. It's because he started pumping. Yeah, so he starts exactly. So it's like these names are everywhere. You just have to know where to look. So he started pumping huge amounts of money into educational institutions, medical institutions, and because he didn't want to be associated with banking, he at the very last minute he had Junius strike his name from the bank. And so overnight it went from Peabody to Morgan. And at the time that was a huge loss for Junius because all the name was in Peabody. Because Peabody was the established name
the British
in transatlantic exactly in transatlantic merchant banking. And so that was how the bank went from the outside to becoming the Morgan Bank. And then early on they were primarily just selling railway bonds. And
war
so
bonds too.
And also war bonds. And so their big break was actually in 1871 during the Franco-Prussian War. So this was the war that turned basically the German states into like what we today recognize as Germany, and which was very much led by Prussia and Bismarck and its military. So Prussia goes to war with France in 1871, and at the famous Battle of Sedan, the Prussian army basically encircles 100,000 French soldiers, and they capture personally Napoleon III, who was Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew.
Wow.
And then after that battle, the French declare a levy of masse. So this is the same thing that happened in the French Revolution, where they basically said, you know, just because our army's gone, we're gonna keep fighting. We're gonna we're gonna rally soldiers from the countryside, and we're basically gonna wage a guerrilla war. And so for a while, it looked like there was gonna be no end to the war. And so when they started raising, you know, more forces to keep on fighting after the Battle of Sedan, they needed rifles and all these things. So they started to they went to all the major banking houses in London and they asked for money to buy rifles.
The French went to London.
Yeah.
That's quite
ironic. I mean London was the center of world finance at the time.
Even their arch enemies like the French, they'd be funding like.
Yeah, of course. It's money. It's a business. The two biggest banks were the Rothschilds and the Barings, and so they went to London, and all the banks turned them down because Bismarck basically started like a propaganda campaign, saying that the French wouldn't repay their debts, and so Junius Morgan saw that and saw an opportunity. So what he did was he basically took the entire net worth of the family at the time, which I think was just like a few million, and he gave it all to the French.
That's a crazy investment.
He gave it all his war bonds to the French Republic after they lost the Battle of Sedan, and it was so bad that usually when banks issue bonds like this, they'll do what's called like a syndication. So they don't hold the bonds on their balance sheets. They sell the bonds to other banks or investors or institutions. And so it was so bad that they weren't able to sell all the bonds. So basically they were holding on to all the bonds that they'd sold to they were holding on to all the debt. They weren't able to resell the debt as banks usually do. And so it was a huge risk. But then what happened is that the French ended up surrendering. If you're familiar with the history of the period, the French surrender. Germany becomes Germany.
Yep.
And then after that, they were paid back at a huge premium.
The Morgan family.
Yeah, the Morgan family. And so this was kind of like their big break.
So this was
is
the
what-
first time any kind of American investment bank basically funded a European war. Is that what you're saying?
I don't
To a
know.
major-
I don't know.
to a
If
major
it's,
degree,
I don't know if it's the first time. I don't know if it's the first time, but
But a pretty
But
significant.
it was a significant episode. It certainly was a significant episode. And then the other big break was in 1873. You had what was called the railroad stock panic. So every about 10 or 20 years in American history,
There was a
there's
panic,
there's some
yeah.
kind of major panic or financial crisis,
Right.
as we're all familiar with now. And in 1873, the particular crisis was that basically there was a huge hype behind the creation of the railway system, and so you had lots of money going into the railways, going into railway construction companies, and so the railways were just overbuilt everywhere. But then there was so much rail that there was so much competition pushing the prices down, and so they weren't able to. These railways basically were in huge debt from the construction,
And they went
but they
bankrupt.
weren't able to pay back the debt,
Right.
because there was just so much railway. Like there was more railway than there was demand to use the railways, and so
And that's kind
so-
of, I mean, just to pause there, because now obviously a lot of railroads are sort of done by government.
Yeah,
Sort of, and I think back
exactly.
then it was private companies, right? Like the Pennsylvania Railroad.
Yeah,
Company.
exactly. It was all exactly. You're right. So it was all private, and so there was very little oversight. And
Especially
at
back
the
then, when the
time-
modern financial system was sort of, in its very early.
Exactly, and so at the time, the largest bank in the U.S. was what's called the James Cook Bank in Pennsylvania, and these guys were like what the Morgans were before the Morgans became the Morgans. They were like the big banking family in Philadelphia, and if you were living at the time, it would seem like they were invincible. But what happened is that they had huge exposure to railway stock during the 1873 crash, and so basically overnight, the James Cook Bank just went bankrupt, and this basically left the Morgan family as the only large bank capable of funding the American financial system left standing. And so I think between those two episodes, like what you can conclude is it was just an incredible amount of like being at the right place at the right time, and also just being intrepid and being incredibly lucky. So
Because so
between
much of
those two-
finance back then was so speculative, right? It
Exactly,
was really
it was all
basically
speculative.
almost a way of gambling. Right? When you
Yeah,
talk
you're
about
right.
the
It's all
banks,
speculative.
It was pure speculation, right? So I mean, just look at the way in which the Morgans bet on, the Third Republic. I mean,
Yeah, it was just a
one of the
huge
ballsy-
bet. Exactly. It was a
Just-
huge multi-million-dollar bet that
That
paid
staked
off.
their
And
entire-
then 2 years later, your biggest competitor closes, which leaves you as the only financer. So it's just a complete, I mean, as with all things, it's just a combination of luck, incredible luck, but also just like incredible daringness. And then what happens from basically that period until 1910, 1920 is that the Morgans pretty much have a monopoly on like the American financial system. So like they were the bank that you would go to whenever there was an issue in the American financial system. So like presidents, sovereigns would literally go to them personally. And there was the Morgan family had two large yachts called the Corsair 1, and the Corsair 2. And there would be, like sovereigns, kings, governments, American presidents would come and meet them on their yacht. And everything was very clandestine and behind closed doors. Like this was what was called the era of relationship banking. So these banks were, they had relatively secretive offices, like they weren't ostentatious, and whoever, let's say like you were a company, whoever you went with as a banker, that would be your banker for life. And it was very taboo to have more than one bank or to change banks.
It was so personalized, right?
Exactly. It was all
like
personalized.
WhatsApp
Like,
banking.
yeah, exactly. Like you
somebody
were
in.
friends.
Exactly.
Yeah, you were friends with your banker. Different. Yeah.
It's not a
exactly.
formalized, institutionalized system. At
Yeah,
this
it
point.
it was very different from today, where it's like like a typical rich family will have multiple banks, and just to like hedge your risk, and everything is electronic and relatively impersonal. Like this was a very different era. Exactly, this was a very different era, and there was almost no government oversight. Everything was private, and because of that, the U.S. economy had to pretty much rely on these secretive banks. So that's also why there were huge amounts of conspiracy theories surrounding the Morgan Bank, just because they
were the only one.
Yeah. Well, no. There were a lot of banks, but I mean more on like a level of secrecy. No one actually knew what was going on. So the first time the public ever got access to the Morgan Bank, to the Morgan Bank balance sheets, was in the 1930s during the New Deal, when there were calls for financial reform. So up until even the partners, no one knew. The only people who knew the full assets of the bank was the Morgan family. Even the top partners didn't know, because everything, exactly, that's how secretive everything was. And so anytime the economy had to be bailed out during, because remember, the Federal Reserve was it was established in 1913.
Right.
And so prior to that, there was just no Federal Reserve. And so actually what ends up happening is that the Morgan Bank takes on the role of a government Federal Reserve. And so anytime there was some kind of major issue in the economy, the Morgan Bank would literally lead a coalition to orchestrate a bailout. So, for example, in 1893, when the U.S. economy went on to the gold standard, what happened is that there were a lot of rich Londoners buying U.S. gold, and so it was threatening to bankrupt the U.S. because the thing is, if you're on the gold standard, you have to keep a certain amount of gold reserves to keep the economy running. And so what happens is that they're about to go bankrupt, and then the Morgan Bank orchestrates a bailout, and this is. Because today, there's a financial crisis, like 2008 being the most salient example. You have someone like, you would have the Fed chair like Ben Bernanke or now Jerome Powell.
Yes.
They would they would call together government heads, but there was nothing like that. Yeah, there was nothing like that back then. It was just J.P. Morgan. And so, yeah, it's like J.P. Morgan was basically a one-man Fed. And in fact, so the idea of the Fed, when it was first conceptualized, was essentially to play the role that the Morgan Bank was playing in the economy. So the actual
in the late 19th century.
Yeah, exactly. So the actual Federal Reserve itself was designed designed to essentially take on the role, because they realized that we couldn't, like the role of like a last lender and of a government bailout type institution cannot be left to the private sector. I mean, that was the idea. And so we have to basically take this and make this a government body. And so, yeah, and so that's just to illustrate, I think, the power and influence they had over the economy. And as the main bank, they also helped build trust, and particularly during railroad consolidations. And so they pretty much owned like a very large portion of the economy. Like they were on, I think, the Morgan family or Morgan partners, they were on the board of almost every single major corporation and major railroad in the US. And that includes industries in steel, mining, cars, General Electric, AT&T.
That's also important, because this is
they were really everywhere.
This is the period, right, of the Gilded Age where we had outsized sort of almost domination of these U.S. corporations, right? The rise of these very powerful billionaires that suddenly were wielding power that almost sort of rivaled that of a government, right? And probably if you go back 100 years, that of like a very, very powerful general or some kind of a leader, right? So this has honestly never been seen before, and it's J.P. Morgan really is kind of the king of the banking sector, it sounds like. But let's also remember that there were so many other major U.S. industries that were dominating at this time. So that's actually one of my questions, like kind of how did J.P. Morgan interact with, like Standard or that was Standard Oil came much later, actually, right?
Who did, sorry?
Standard Oil.
No. Standard Oil was also around this time. Standard Oil was
the Rockefeller Empire, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder. I mean, it was all just happening at the same moment.
That's a good question. So the way that Ron Chernow explains it in his book House of Morgan, on which almost all this information is based, this is like the main book that popularized this history. But the way he explained it is that we're at a time where companies and corporations were relatively weak. So, if you think of it today, like today, the world is basically run by large corporations, but it was like large monopolistic corporations. I mean, think like Amazon, Apple, these kind of companies. But
Google.
those didn't exist going into the 19th century was when these corporations were starting to exist. Right? Exactly, we're starting to form. And the thing is, and you had a huge amount of consolidation happening, particularly in steel and oil.
Exactly.
So Carnegie and Rockefeller are the two biggest examples. But the thing is that whenever you want to form these kind of these monopolies, they're usually formed under trust. So you have a trust which will also act as a holding company, which will effectively buy out all of their competitors.
Yeah.
But the thing is, in order to buy out those competitors, you need more capital. And so where do you get that? You go to the bank. And so the banks were behind a lot of these major consolidations, because the thing is, like on a philosophical level, both Junius and JP Morgan were huge monopolists. So that's also why they helped, because they realized that if there's too much competition, it would push prices down, which would compress profits. And so this was kind of the root cause of the 1873 panic, was that there was just too much competition.
Right.
And so Junius and JP Morgan both strongly believed actually that the economy would function better under these very large bodies. And so they were happy to help these companies consolidate these large industries. Because also the thing is, when they loaned out to these large corporations, they end up collateralizing the debt that they issue against these companies. And so what ended up happening is that the bank would end up owning a lot of these companies, because if they ever failed to repay the debt, exactly, then the bank would foreclose and just take the companies, right? So that's a really good question. But I think that the way to understand it is that the monopolistic corporatism that came out of this period was very much like built and supported by the Morgan Bank. And the only exception, I think this is important, the only exception was Rockefeller, was oil, because oil was just so profitable. So the oil consolidation that happened, the Standard Oil consolidation happened almost entirely just using dividends reinvesting profit back into the business, because oil was just so huge. But every other major trust, like steel, worked very closely with the banking system.
I think
that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. I think what I find so interesting about this family is kind of like how it plays such a role in so many periods of not just U.S. history but world history. I think now that we're coming into the turn of the 1900s, right? Like, curious kind of how, like, how do they get into sort of like funding, World War One, and how did they have such an outsized impact in doing that? I think like seeing that development is kind of interesting for me as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, yeah, so going into the 20th century was particularly interesting because what happened now is, okay, if we wind back all the way to the beginning, they started out as like a London-based merchant bank with an American satellite. And going into the 20th century, as we discussed earlier, this is a time when America becomes the largest economy in the world. But the thing is that people were not really aware of it until much later.
Because
some people not even until the 1930s. And so what happens overnight is that, I mean, like, it feels overnight, is that the Morgan Bank becomes the most powerful bank in the most powerful country in the world.
It's like it's coinciding.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they're riding the wave. This is again goes back to right place, right time. They happen to be well positioned to take advantage of rising U.S. hegemony, and are very much builders of that. And whereas for example, the two biggest European banks before that are the Rothschilds and the Barings, who everyone knows of. But the thing is that those banks were Europe focused. And so they were blind to the fact that they were being eclipsed by the U.S. And it's in part because the U.S. domestic economy was so strong. So actually,
it was isolation. They were just not really
exactly
engaging with other powers, right? If you think about the mass and size of the country and how much diversity and how many communities are there, I mean, it totally makes sense.
And then the other point is that, well, there's a few points, but I think the first is that because of isolationism. I think isolationism is a difficult term because it's kind of like a single, like a mononym that refers to something much more complex. But one thing that's important to stress in the early 20th century is that isolationism only applied politically. It was the American government that had no interest in international affairs. But the thing is, as a transatlantic bank lending to foreign powers, like, your primary market is the world.
Absolutely.
And the American merchant marine knew it too, So the thing is, at this point, America has a huge economy, and they're looking for overseas markets, and the banks are already very close with overseas, with overseas powers and overseas banks, and so the Morgan Bank was actually one of the most pro-international in terms of outlook at this time, because they recognized that America's future would be abroad.
Wow.
And so what happened is that what happens in the early 20th century is that you basically have the Morgan Bank conducting foreign policy on behalf of the U.S. as a state.
And that's because of their unchecked level of power.
Yeah, well,
Their sort of
it's
direct access, as
It's
you're
both,
saying,
and it's
to
also
presidents
because
and
direct
politicians.
access to presidents and politicians, to overseas presidents and politicians, and the fact that the U.S. political system was inwards looking.
And was bankrolled basically by
Yeah, and was bankrolled in
There's
a sense.
financial
And then
incentive.
no, and then simultaneously, I mean, just to kind of like emphasize the scale of how much they were involved in, it was during this time too that the Morgan. So the Titanic was actually built by the Morgan Shipping Trust because they were competing. They were competing with British Shipping Trust, and some people also believe that the Morgans were to blame for its crashing because the Morgans wanted to rush out the Titanic, and they built it with the focus on ostentatiousness rather than safety. So for example, they had like the Titanic had this huge suite, like basically like there a large part of it was just like a palace. Like there was a huge palace inside the Titanic that was just for Jack Morgan. And actually,
Well, good thing he didn't go on that.
yeah,
Huh?
no, and they were supposed to too. That's the thing. They were supposed to go into the Titanic, but they canceled last minute, so they almost went down. I know it's ironic. So at the time, there were a lot of like this is also the era of muckraking. So it's like people like particularly the general public, the media were starting to realize that there was a huge that there were these oligarchs behind who were hiding in plain sight, who basically ran the country and ran the economy and to an extent ran the world economy.
Yeah, and they're not elected. They don't have
Yeah, exactly. They're not elected. There's no oversight,
and they're just running everything.
Yeah.
Not everything, but with a significant amount of power and influence that needs to sort of now be tapered and controlled.
Exactly. So what you have is like the expansion of Morgan influence abroad and on the international scale, but you also see more checks and balances developing at home. And this is also when antitrust starts to become a thing. So,
Right.
so
Yeah.
you
This
have-
is the turn of the 1910s.
yeah, so exactly
right,
1910s.
So post-progressive, finally, like people are. Or
Yeah,
this is the progressive era.
No,
anyways.
progressive era would be more like the 1930s with the New Deal. But this was almost like the proto-progressive era. It's like you have
This was a
like
proto-progressive era.
people are starting to investigate the Morgan Bank. So you have like what's called the Pujo Committee in 1913, which was to investigate like basically whether Wall Street banks were in a large cabal. And this leads to the 17th Amendment,
Oh,
which
right.
authorized the federal income tax and the Federal Reserve Act, which creates the Federal Reserve, and also the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was an addendum to the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act, and to this day was the last major antitrust legislation passed at the federal level. So this is quite literally like one of the most important years in American history and potentially in world history. If you consider how intertwined the American financial system is with the rest of the world.
Right, and let's also be clear that John Pierpont Morgan is still alive during this whole
Yeah,
time.
exactly, and he's still,
Right.
the man, yeah, exactly.
It's not like it's changing. It's the same.
Up and running. Yeah,
It's the same guy.
and he dies in 1913, shortly after testifying at the Pujo hearings and after the Titanic. And so a lot of his close partners and family actually accused Pujo of killing him because he was so stressed about the hearings.
Wow. Rip
And,
Alexander, huh?
Yeah. So John Pierpont dies in 1913, and his empire goes on. It's passed down to his son Jack Morgan.
Could have been on the Titanic, but was not.
Yeah. Well, I think they were both supposed to go together. Yeah.
That was a crazy. Wow.
Yeah, and so actually, it was under Jack Morgan that the Morgan Bank kind of expands internationally and reaches arguably the height of its power, but also becomes checked. So this came in the 1930s. Because what's funny actually is that when they first created the Federal Reserve Act, the actual Federal Reserve itself that we now know in Washington D.C. had very minimal power. So instead, they created, I think it was like around 10, maybe like 12 or 13 state level Federal Reserves, and each of them would kind of act individually. But
That must have been chaotic as hell.
Yeah, it's very chaotic, but I mean, it's classic, American political system,
Right,
because you
federalist,
don't,
yeah.
exactly. You don't want to federalize and centralize power, and so instead you distribute it. But then what happens is that because of just the way the American economy was set up at the time, all the power was concentrated in the New York Federal Reserve. So the actual Federal Reserve in Washington had almost no power. It was basically just like a for show authority.
Figure.
All of the power was vested in the New York Federal Reserve, and they were very close with the Morgan family.
So where
One of the
where was the
ironies.
Morgan family based throughout all of this?
Yeah,
New
so
York,
they were,
right? Or
yeah,
was
so
it
they
still
were,
in-
yeah, so that's a good question. So eventually, kind of like during the Second Great Divergence period, they moved their headquarters from London back to New York, and so they officially become a New York bank, but then they also had outposts in London and in Paris. So in Paris it was Morgan Hodges, in London it was Morgan Grenfell. So where they partner with like large local banks.
Ah.
And so if you remember Deutsche Bank's IB arm being Morgan Deutsche Grand no, it was Deutsche Morgan Grenfell, that came out of that was basically like the Morgan's London bank. And so but all of these were basically subsidiaries, or not subsidiaries, but they were kind of like the seat of power was in New York at the main bank.
Wow.
But the thing is that I mean the Morgans were international before the age of of mass of like multi-country international billionaires. Like they had these huge yachts, and they would travel all around. They would go around Europe on their yachts, and they had houses all over the U.S. They had these huge estates in Connecticut and in Upper New England.
Very Great Gatsby.
Yeah, I know.
Almost.
Literally, it is the era of Great Gatsby.
But I think that's honestly a really good spot to sort of end, right? Like right as we're getting to the
Yeah,
turn
exactly.
of World War One, then we have the interwar period, we have World War Two, and then obviously J.P. Morgan, what it is today. And of course, you have the Great Depression in between then too. So it's gonna be a lot of more interesting topics related to J.P. Morgan. So yeah, stay tuned, and we're definitely gonna continue the story in the next episode.
For sure.
Thanks, guys.